So next, we're going to talk about displays of data. I said at the beginning that statistics was the collection, the display, and the analysis of data. And so we're going to talk about displays of data, graphs. Some of these graphs you probably haven't seen since elementary school. And so I'll show how to make them, but really what I'm more focused on is how to read these, and just so you make sure you understand where the data is coming from and what it's looking like. So for the first one is not actually a graph. It's kind of an organization, a frequency table. And so I want to use the data from the 10 people that we just talked about and identified, these 10 people from the 2000 census. And we're going to focus on one particular graph, and that's the age. We're going to talk about the age of these 10 people. Okay? So what we're going to do here, and so age, and we are going to group these, okay? And so usually when you're grouping something, again, this is numerical data, and the folks back in the data table, we're going to take a peek here. We look at these, and usually I'll look at what the largest value and what the smallest value. So it looks like the youngest person on here is 22. And it looks like the oldest person on here is 61. Okay. And so I got to make sure that my groups include go as low or lower than 21 and go as high or higher than 61. And I like to use kind of round numbers with my group. And so I'm going to group these in tens, okay? And so I'm going to say, and so on here, I just write this in a couple different ways. I could write that there are 20 to 30. Now, when I write this as 20 to 30, it's understood that the lower end is included, 20, and that the higher end is not included, because if you're looking at these top lines, right? 20 to 30, and then 30 to 40, and then 40 to 50, 50 to 60, 60 to 70. So if someone's 30, where do I put them? Do I put them in the 20 to 30 or the 30 to 40? And so right below each of these is kind of an explanation. This means that X is greater than or equal to 20. And so this group includes 20 because it's greater than or equal to it. But it does not include 30. And so basically another way, in this case, because we've got discrete data, we don't have any decimals. It's really the same thing as 20 to 29. And so there's really three ways, and especially, like I said, when we're talking about age, after you get to be like 3 years old, you're not going to say someone was 29 3/4. You're just using what the base of their age is, okay? And so when we go through there, we see that there were 4 people who were between 20 and 29. And I'll just show this first one to show. And so the 22-year-old, the 26-year-old, the 27-year-old, and another 27-year-old. So there are 4 people who were between 20 and 30 years old. There were 4 people. And if we repeated that, and so this is the frequency, this is how many times in those 10 people we saw people who were 20 to 30. And if we did between 30 and 40, again, basically 30 to 39, we would see that there are 3 people there. And between 40 and 50, there are 2 people. Between 50 and 60, there weren't any. And then there was the 61-year-old. And so there was 1 year. And so we want to make sure that we're capturing all of these. And sometimes we might, if we're given a table, we might have to add another row on because we want to cover that. So this is the frequency. Okay? So for each of these groups, this is how many times each age showed. 4 people between 20 and 30, 3 between 30 and 40, and so forth. Frequency. How often it happens. The next column is cumulative frequency. And it looks a little scary, but it's not that bad. So for the cumulative frequency, and sorry, before I forget, I want to make sure that when we make this table, if we knew there were 10 people in that table of data, I want to make sure that the 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 equals 10, which it does. And that's just kind of a little verification here that we caught everybody. Okay, so for the cumulative frequency, for the first one, it's basically, hey, how many people are less than 30? Okay, well, there are 4. 4 between less than 30. Okay, well, then for the next one, the cumulative, you're accumulating people. How many people were less than 40 years old? So what we need to do is take into account the 4 that we already had, and then now we have 3 new between 30 and 40, and we add those together, and we get to the 7. And then, okay, well, how many are less than 50? Well, we have the 7 that were less than 40, and now we have 2 more people who are between 40 and 50, and so we add them to the 7, and we get to 9. Again, there's nothing here, stays at 9, and then finally the last one is 10. And we want to make sure that that last number captures is the number of people that we have overall. And so these 2 numbers always have to match. Okay? And then, so that's for frequency. That's basically what I'll call the count. How many people? This next column is relative frequency. And so for the relative, you say, oh, there are 4 people between 20 and 30 years old. Is that a lot? I don't know. Out of how many? So I want for the relative frequency, it's basically out of how many. And so our numerator is going to match our frequency here. The frequency number is always going to be the same in both relative frequency and frequency. But we're going to have a denominator here, and that denominator has to be the total number of people, the frequency. And so we've got 4 out of 10 between 20 and 30, 3 out of 10 between 30 and 40, 2 out of 10, none here, it doesn't matter if it's 0 or 0 out of 10, it doesn't matter. And then finally 1 out. And so the sum of this always has to be 1 or 100%. Okay? That's the total of that. All right? Then we have the cumulative relative frequency. And so now we're combining the cumulative frequency with the relative frequency. And so we're going to do the same exercise. We start with 4, and that's 4. But it's relative frequency out of the 10. So we're always going to have 10 in the denominator, just like we had 10 in the denominator on here. So 4 out of 10, add the 3, 7 out of 10, add the 2 that are in their 40s, 9 out of 10, none, no more added, still 9, and 10. And again, this last number also has to be matching this, 1 or 100%. And so that's just kind of organizing it. And so I don't think, now what that'll do is it'll kind of organize us so we can make graphs if we want to do that. So just want to go through this. So making a histogram. So a histogram helps us to find out the shape of a distribution. Okay, and it's useful for large data sets because we can kind of get bars and scale them down if we have a lot of values. We do lose the individual data values whenever our width is more than 1 of a class, but we're able to describe a characteristic. A key thing here, frequency is always the vertical axis. Always the vertical axis. Okay, and so if we're looking at the that data table that we made from that 10 people from the census, we'll just kind of quickly do this. Because there was no one under 20, rather than wasting space and just having empty white space on here, we would just put a little thing called a jump or a skip that's two hash marks. Sometimes it'll show up as one hash mark. Sometimes it'll show up with a little squiggly to show that there's nothing going on in here and that the graph kind of got smushed. And so then, again, frequency is always the vertical. And so I want to make sure, okay, make sure it's tall enough. Well, my largest frequency on the table that we just made was 4. So I'm making 4 the highest and then making these proportional. And so between 20 and 30 years old, there were 4 people. Between 30 and 40, we had 3. There's 2 here. None between 50 and 60, and 1 between 60 and 70. Key thing here, it's easy to forget. In fact, I went over it, I didn't talk about it. We need to label our axes, right? So this horizontal axis is age, and really, if I wanted to be even more clear, I would say in years. But when we're talking about age, most of the time it's assumed to be years. And we did have this frequency. Yep, that's a histogram. Nothing too super scary. And so that'll be it. That's for kind of making your data table and using that to make a histogram. Till next time.